Hello everyone. Today I'm going to share with you 3 stories of missing people with a very unusual and unsettling twist. However, this is going to be different than other missing people stories you hear on the internet. Of the 3 stories that are about to be told, only 2 of them are real. The other one is completely false and written by myself. I'll be changing the names of the people involved in the real stories in case you may recognize them. By the end of the 3rd story, you can make up your prediction of which you think is true and which was made up, and I'll reveal which ones are 100% accurate. If this sounds like something you'd like to see more of, please subscribe, turn on all notifications, and hit the like button so I know to make more. Thank you, and let's begin. Story number 1. From Texas to Spain. In the early 1990s, in Texas, a 14-year-old boy by the name of Travis Baker disappeared without a trace. He was last seen playing basketball, but he never made it home. What happened over the course of the next several years shocked everyone involved. The family said they had issues with Travis. He had run away from home in the past, but he always returned after one day at most. As weeks turned into months without a single lead, they feared over when, if ever, they would see Travis again. That was until 3 years after he disappeared, they received a phone call that would change their lives forever. Law enforcement officials in Texas got a phone call that a man in a youth center in Spain who said he had just escaped from a sex ring identified himself as Travis Baker. The Baker family couldn't believe it. A phone call that they had been praying for had finally come. Their son was alive, but according to the youth center in Spain, he was not well. They believed he had been severely abused. He would not speak much about his captors or what had happened to him in the past 3 years. Travis's older sister, as quickly as possible, hopped on a plane and flew to Spain to bring her brother home. Upon arriving at the shelter, she anxiously waited in the lobby for her brother to come down. And when he finally did, she was overwhelmed with joy. She put her hands on the side of his face and said, "Did you think I wouldn't remember you? I would never forget that nose." On the flight home, she noticed he didn't speak much. She believed it was because of all the abuse he had been forced to endure over the last 3 years. She was just elated that she was finally able to bring him home to their family. Upon arriving in Texas, the entire family was waiting at the airport. When Travis nervously walked out from the terminal, he was once again greeted by joy. His mother gave him a massive hug as they had all missed him so much. They didn't want to rush Travis, just ease him back into his life. But as time went on, more and more questions came, and a few people started to doubt that this man was in fact the missing child from 3 years prior. He was very tall, even considering the 3-year time lapse. He had brown eyes when Travis had blue, and had brown stubble growing into a beard when Travis was blonde. Most importantly, he spoke with a European accent. He also refused to give blood samples or give his fingerprints. He did finally give a statement about what happened to him when he was abducted 3 years prior. He claimed he was taken by a secret military group. They were raped and beaten every single day, moved constantly across the world, never in one place for too long or even knowing where they were. They were beaten if they spoke in an American accent and given drops to change their eye color. Travis said he was being held in a dungeon-like area, but managed to escape and run into the streets at night, later realizing that he was in Spain. His family, still believing he was their son, were heartbroken realizing at what he had gone through. However, in the late 1990s, nearly 4 years after the initial disappearance, the FBI got a court order and forced him to give blood samples and fingerprints, which later determined that the man claiming to be Travis Baker was indeed a fake. He was a French serial imposter who had been charged with nearly 500 counts of stealing different identities, 3 of which were children. Even though a crime of this nature can hold a sentence of 2 years in jail, the French imposter was sentenced to 6 years due to the harm he inflicted on the Baker family. He has since been released and is married with 3 children. No sign of the real Travis Baker has been reported to this day. Story number 2. Leaving it all behind. John Hollinar was a 45-year-old successful businessman in Los Angeles. He made his money in the investment world. He didn't buy and sell stocks or bonds. He just helped people invest their money the proper way. He started small, but grew and eventually was taking home commissions of $50,000 a month. He had built a team of other dealers that looked to him for guidance. He was married with 2 little girls, and he seemed to have it all. Money was never a stressor, but because of the team he had built, he collected a portion of their commissions. So he was able to work a lot less without dropping in salary. Yet, many of his employees said that he seemed depressed, unable to seem to enjoy everything that he had worked so hard for. And he had been like this for years. One day, his office got a phone call from one of John's clients. They had booked a meeting with John, and he was to show up at his client's house for 10 a.m., but he never arrived. and it was unlike John to ever be late. The office had called John's cell, but it went straight to voicemail, indicating that his phone wasn't even on. Confused, but not yet worried, they called his house to see if he had stopped by there, and when his wife answered, she said that she hadn't seen him since that morning. So far, no one was overly concerned. Just a few more calls were made to his cell, but the same result happened. When evening came, with still no progress, John's wife became worried. It wasn't like him to go this long without contacting her or any of his employees. She called the police, and John was officially declared missing. His picture was all over the news of Los Angeles, and while several calls did come in, it always ended up being someone who just had similar features. It was never John. Several weeks passed and no progress was made. John had helped a lot of people become financially independent. He had no known enemies, no money was taken from his account, indicating he may have run away. All of his personal belongings remained at home. It seemed like he had simply vanished without a trace. John would be seen again though, but it would be years, 14 to be exact, before he would resurface. At this point, the case had run cold. Many theories had developed over what had happened, the most common being that he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, was murdered, and his body was dumped somewhere unlikely to ever be found. However, in 2003, one of John's former employees, Brad, was walking in a slightly more rough side of Los Angeles and saw a man sitting up against a wall. This part of Los Angeles had a very high crime rate. Many homeless people set up their tents in this area, so seeing someone slightly disheveled wouldn't really stand out. However, when Brad saw this particular man just sitting there reading a book, he believed that he had recognized him. The man had a long, gray beard, clearly had not showered for a while, so his hair was tangled and ratty, but he walked up to him nonetheless. The motion of Brad caught the homeless man's eyes and he looked up. Before Brad could say anything, the homeless man simply said, "So, are you finally the boss?" Brad couldn't believe it. He had no doubt that this man was John Holinar, who had been missing for 14 years. He didn't even know how to reply. He was in shock. This man had a huge influence for Brad when he started out. He simply said, "Is it okay if I sit down?" The two talked for maybe an hour. The homeless man did confirm his identity as John Holinar, talked about his business and his life from before. Brad simply couldn't believe how he could go from a high six-figure earner to homeless on the streets. Brad claimed, as he was talking about his former life, he painted it in such a negative fashion, stating just how unhappy he was, but he never really did exactly say why. He never gave Brad a direct answer as to what had happened, but Brad strongly believed that John left that life on purpose. When it was getting dark, John suggested that Brad be on his way, as Skid Row gets much worse at night. Brad had to ask one last question. "What about your wife and kids?" he said. And John simply replied, "What about them?" Brad didn't know how to digest that. He left and immediately reported that he had found John Holinar. News of his whereabouts spread throughout the city, and of course, his ex-wife, now remarried, had learned that John was alive and well after all this time. People went back to the spot where Brad had spoke with him, but John was nowhere to be found. In fact, he was never seen again. He had simply vanished for a second time. This time, he has yet to resurface. Some doubt whether that homeless man really was John Holinar, but Brad was convinced he recognized his mentor. Plus, he knew things that only John would know. How someone could leave his wife and kids behind like that isn't clear. But one more disturbing factor is that where Brad spoke with John was only a 15-minute drive from where his wife and kids were living. Story number 3. Mystery for 100 years. In the early 1900s, a 4-year-old boy by the name of Henry Bolden and his parents went on a mini retreat in Louisiana. It wasn't a lake house that they were staying at, but more of a swamp area as opposed to a luscious resort. Henry's father had to leave earlier than planned due to a work commitment, and Henry, who was quite upset at this, kept throwing temper tantrums. One day, Henry saw his older friend Paul, who was going to go fishing that afternoon. Henry begged his mother to let him join Paul on the fishing trip, and because she had a lot on her plate now that her husband was gone, and she trusted Paul, who was very close with Henry, she let him go. Paul took Henry and several other friends out fishing for the afternoon. Upon his return, at some point, as Paul is unsure when, he noticed that Henry was no longer with the group. It wasn't long until panic started to run through the group. Henry's mother was frantic and running around screaming her son's name. She became overstressed and even ended up fainting. The search, however, kept going on into the night. They searched the grounds, the water, everywhere they thought that Henry might have been. All they had found was a set of footprints near a bank that could have possibly been Henry's, but they disappeared near a set of train tracks. Henry has seemed to have completely vanished. As the weeks passed, the search for Henry continued. Many thought he may have been eaten by the wildlife, most likely an alligator. They even checked the insides of some gators, but all were empty. Then they moved on to thinking that he may have been kidnapped. The family and friends of the family together had raised close to what would be $130,000 in today's money. Henry's father even said that he didn't care who it was or what happened. He just wanted his son back. Weeks turned into months, and when 8 months had passed, many had lost hope. However, in Mississippi, a man was seen with a boy who matched Henry's description. The man, named Charles, was a traveling general worker. When asked about the boy, Charles would continuously change his story, at one point claiming the child was his, and at other times saying that he was his uncle. Eventually, after Charles was brought in for questioning, he confessed that the boy was the illegitimate son of his brother and their maid. However, authorities didn't believe him, and they called the Bolden family and told them that they believed that they had found their missing son. They believed that this boy was Henry. When the Bolden family came to see the boy, at first the mother wasn't sure, and the boy didn't even seem to react to the name Henry or recognize any of the family. However, the next day, the mother said she had recognized a mole on the boy's neck and said, yes, this is my son. She returned home with him, ecstatic that she had finally found her son. The town even threw a parade. The story, however, it does not end here. Eventually, another woman came forward, claiming that the boy was not Henry Bolden, but was in fact her son, Richard Michaels. This woman turned out to be the maid that Charles had referred to earlier. She had let Richard go with Charles for a few days, but few days turned into several months. She was allowed to meet with the boy that she claimed was Richard, but most now believed to be Henry Bolden. Initially, she wasn't even sure if it was him. And again, the boy didn't react to seeing this woman either. But once again, the next day when she came to see him, she said that yes, this is my son. This boy's real name is Richard Michaels. The boy, however, he still didn't react to her. Authorities and the media didn't believe her. They continued to believe that this boy was Henry Bolden, and the woman was painted with a very negative light. The man who was initially found with Henry was sentenced to life in prison for kidnapping, but later released on an appeal. All seemed to be concluded. Henry grew up at Bolden and got married and had 4 children. The woman went on to have several more children herself, but always claimed how the Bolden family stole one of her children. Henry eventually died at the age of 58. The story, however, is still not over. Several years after the death of Henry Bolden, his granddaughter, who was always fascinated with the case, started to have doubts about who her grandfather really was. She convinced several members of her family, including her father, to get a DNA test to confirm. When the results were in, it was determined that her father was not related to the rest of the Bolden family, meaning that the boy who was found 8 months after the disappearance of Henry Bolden was in fact not Henry Bolden. While it didn't confirm that his real name was Richard Michaels, it did certainly appear that way. Descendants of the Michaels family were happy, feeling that it gave some vindication to their history. However, it still left one big question unanswered. The real Henry Bolden remained missing. To this day, no one knows what really happened. So that's it. The story of 3 missing people with unsettling twists. Can you guess which one was false? Is it story number 1, a family believing that a stranger was their son? Or story number 2, a man leaving a successful career to live on the streets? Or story number 3, a young boy who lived a lie only to be uncovered decades after his death? Well, let's start with story number 1. Story number 1 is 100% a true story, with the real name of the missing child being Nicholas Barclay and the imposter being Frederick Borden. Borden himself, even from jail, tried to steal the identities of other missing children, and he showed no remorse for the grief he caused the Barclay family, giving them false hope that their son was still alive. After it was proved that he was a fake, it did lead many to wondering what really happened to Nicholas. Many wondered how the Barclay family could believe a stranger was their son, and wondered if they had something to do with his disappearance themselves. Nothing has come to fruition, but there is a lot more to this story. There is a documentary called The Imposter, which is worth a watch. It tells a lot of the story from Frederick Borden's perspective, and just how he could pull all of this off. Now, let's move on to story number 3. This story is completely true, with the real name of the boy who went missing being Bobby Dunbar, and the boy who showed up 8 months later's real name being Bruce Anderson. This story gained a lot of suspicion as to whether or not the boy believed to be Bobby Dunbar was in fact him, mainly because he didn't recognize the Dunbar family initially, nor did they initially recognize him either. When it was confirmed that the man who lived his life under the name Bobby Dunbar was in fact Bruce Anderson all along, people didn't know why he agreed to go along with it. The common theory is that Bobby Dunbar's family was extremely wealthy and gifted the boy with a bike and a pony. So he pretended to be Bobby Dunbar, and that was the role he was stuck with for the rest of his life. That means that story number 2, the man who went missing and decided to live homeless on the streets, is completely false. So that's it. Story of 3 missing people with unsettling twists. Were you able to guess the story that was made up? If so, please leave a comment, like and subscribe so I know to keep making more. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.